welcome to Boring History for Sleep. In tonight's story, we will be exploring a subject that may sound both strange and fascinating, but also very fitting for those who enjoy drifting away to the quieter corners of history. The topic of this video is the most disgusting hygiene habits of French kings. For many people, when they think of French kings, they imagine grand palaces like Versailles, golden crowns and lavish feasts filled with music and elegance. But behind the glittering curtains and marble halls, the daily lives of these kings were far less glamorous. In fact, they were often shockingly unhygienic. From avoiding baths for years to covering their bodies with heavy perfumes instead of soap and water, to living among lice fleas and the stench of overflowing chamber pots, the truth about their habits is both unsettling and oddly fascinating. In this video, we will slowly and carefully wander through this hidden side of royal life. You will hear about the way French kings feared bathing, how they relied on powders and wigs while pests lived close to their skin, and how even the magnificent Palace of Versailles carried with it a constant smell of waste. We will also reflect on the rotten teeth and painful illnesses that plagued their bodies, all while they continued to rule with the image of majesty and refinement. As always, the pace of this story will be calm and unhurried, told in a quiet voice designed to relax your mind. The strange details of history will be here to keep your thoughts gently occupied, while the soothing tone will help you drift off into sleep. By the time we reach the end, you may not even notice, because hopefully you will already be resting peacefully. So, settle in, make yourself comfortable, and prepare to step back into the world of palaces, perfumes, and very unpleasant smells. This is Boring History for Sleep, the most disgusting hygiene habits of French kings. And so with that picture in mind, let us now gently step into the first part of our story, where we begin to uncover exactly why French kings, despite their crowns and their power, so often smelled so very bad. When most people imagine kings, especially the French kings of the grand age of Versailles, they tend to picture elegance. The mind conjures vast golden halls shimmering in candlelight, marble fountains trickling in the gardens, silk curtains swaying in the breeze, and powdered nobles bowing in carefully choreographed gestures. But what is much harder to imagine is the odor. For beneath all that spectacle, life in the palace carried with it a smell that was anything but pleasant. The smell of a French king was not simply the odor of one individual. It was the odor of the entire world he lived in. A world where perfume replaced water, where unwashed bodies were draped in the finest silk, and where the myth of refinement carefully disguised the truth of decay. From morning until night, the king was surrounded by courtiers, servants, cooks, guards, and attendants. Each of these men and women carried their own scents, their own sweat, their own lack of proper hygiene. And because the king himself set the example, they copied his ways. If the king did not bathe, why should anyone else? The fear of water. One of the most important reasons French kings smelled so bad was not laziness, but fear. The medical knowledge of the time was filled with beliefs that seem strange today. Doctors warned that bathing was dangerous because it opened the pores of the skin, making the body vulnerable to disease. To step into warm water, to allow the pores to relax, was thought to invite death. A king who bathed too often was a king risking his life. Because of this, French kings avoided bathing almost entirely. At best, they might wash their hands or dab their faces with scented cloths. Instead of soap and water, they relied on a change of linen underclothes. Linen was believed to draw impurities out of the body. A fresh shirt, clean sheets, or new stockings were thought to keep a person healthy and clean. But of course, linen could not truly remove sweat, oil, and odor. It only absorbed them temporarily. Under the layers of fine cloth, the body of the king remained unwashed. Perfume as a solution. Perfume became the most important weapon against odor. The French court was drenched in scent. Rooms were sprayed with rose water, musk, and amber. Gloves were perfumed before being worn. Handkerchiefs were soaked in scented oils. Wigs were powdered not only to look fashionable but to smell sweet. And the kings themselves relied on perfume to cover their own natural stench. Louis XIV, the famous Sun King, adored perfume. His body was often surrounded by clouds of it. Musk, orange blossom, and jasmine became part of his daily life. He believed, as did others, that a strong perfume was a sign of refinement. But no matter how much perfume was used, it only covered the truth. Beneath the sweet and floral notes, there lingered the unmistakable smell of unwashed flesh. Courtiers described the air around the king as heavy, not with cleanliness, but with a strange mixture of beauty and foulness. The palaces of odor. It was not only the king's body that smelled. The palaces themselves carried odors that no amount of perfume could truly hide. Versailles, perhaps the most magnificent of all, was notorious for its smell. With thousands of people living, eating, and sleeping inside its walls, and with no proper plumbing for much of its history, the palace became a place where stench was inescapable. Chamber pots were emptied in hallways. Waste was thrown out of windows. The air was thick with the smells of kitchens, refuse, and bodies. When visitors arrived, they often wrote about the beauty of Versailles, but also about the odor. Imagine walking through the glittering hall of mirrors, surrounded by glass and gold, yet catching the smell of chamber pots nearby. Imagine standing in the royal apartments, watching the king receive his courtiers, while just outside the windows the gardens bore the scent of human waste thrown into the bushes. That was the reality of royal life. The king may have smelled bad, but so did his surroundings. The very palace that symbolized French glory was at the same time a palace of odor, the contradiction of refinement and filth. This contradiction is what makes the story of French kings' hygiene so fascinating. On one hand, they represented the height of refinement. Their clothes were made of the finest fabrics. Their jewelry sparkled with diamonds, and their palaces stunned visitors with grandeur. But behind all of this, they lived in a way that seems disgusting today. They were unwashed, their teeth rotted, their palaces stank, and their perfume could not truly cover the reality. To understand why French kings smelled so bad is to understand this contradiction. It was not because they lacked wealth or power. It was because their beliefs about health and cleanliness were so very different from ours. They lived in a time when water was feared, when perfume was medicine, and when appearances mattered more than reality. Daily life and the constant odor. Let us picture a single day in the life of a French king, perhaps Louis XIV. He awakens in his bed, surrounded by courtiers who have come to witness the ritual of the king's rising. The curtains are pulled back, and light enters the room. Already there is a mixture of smells. The scent of linen that has not been washed for weeks, the faint odor of human waste from nearby chamber pots, the heavy air of perfume lingering from the day before. The king does not step into a bath. Instead, his attendants bring him fresh linen. He changes his shirt, believing this change will keep him clean. Then comes the perfume, scented gloves, scented handkerchiefs, and scented oils rubbed into his skin. His wig, powdered and perfumed, is placed upon his head. To those around him, he appears magnificent, but anyone close enough can smell the truth beneath the layers of scent. The rest of the day is filled with more of the same. Meals are served in rooms that smell of hundreds of bodies. The king walks through hallways where chamber pots have been emptied. At night, he returns to his bed, where the sheets may be perfumed, but have not been truly washed. The cycle repeats, day after day, year after year. Eyewitness accounts of odor. Visitors to the French court sometimes wrote about these realities. They described the magnificence of the palace, but also the unpleasantness of its smell. Ambassadors noted that the perfume was so strong it could be overwhelming, and yet it could not truly hide the odors beneath. Servants complained of lice, fleas, and the difficulty of keeping themselves comfortable in such conditions. Even members of the royal family themselves sometimes acknowledged that life at court was not as clean as it appeared. A kingdom of appearances. Ultimately, the reason French kings smelled so bad was that their world was built on appearances. To look magnificent mattered more than to be clean. Perfume mattered more than soap. A fine linen shirt mattered more than an actual bath. The image of refinement was everything, and the reality of filth was simply ignored. For the kings themselves, this seemed normal. For us today, it seems almost unimaginable. And so, as we come to the close of this first chapter, we can see why French kings, despite all their riches and power, lived in a world where they smelled so bad. Their fear of bathing, their dependence on perfume, their unwashed linen, and their stinking palaces all combined to create a life where filth was hidden behind a mask of elegance. But this is only the beginning of the story. For in the next chapter, we will look even closer at one of the most astonishing habits of all: the way French kings completely refused to bathe, sometimes for years at a time. We will explore the strange beliefs that led them to reject water, the rituals they used instead, and the long-lasting impact this had on their daily lives. This is where our journey will take us next, in Chapter 2, French Kings Who Refused to Bathe. To imagine a French king refusing to bathe for years may seem strange today. Yet for the kings of France, this was not only common, but almost expected. Bathing was considered by many physicians and scholars of the time to be a dangerous act. The belief was that when the skin was immersed in warm water, the pores of the body opened, and through those pores, sickness could easily enter. It was thought that water carried disease, and that to expose the body to it was to risk one's health. Because of this fear, French kings avoided baths almost entirely, and instead created other ways of keeping themselves what they believed to be clean. Louis XIV, the famous son. King is one of the most striking examples. It is said that he bathed only a handful of times in his entire life. His doctors advised him against regular bathing, and so he trusted linen changes and perfumes as his daily form of cleanliness. The linen shirt was thought to draw away the impurities of the body, so by changing into fresh linen, he was believed to be made clean again. In reality, of course, his skin remained covered in sweat oil and dirt. But because the shirt was changed, the king and his court felt satisfied that cleanliness had been achieved. This practice was not unique to Louis XIV. Many French kings before him and after him followed the same ideas. Henry IV, for example, was known for being especially dirty. He was even mocked by his own contemporaries for the bad smell of his body and his clothes. His mistresses complained of his odor, yet he was not ashamed, for to him, bathing was not only unnecessary but harmful. When he did wash, it was usually in the form of a quick sponge with scented water, rather than a full immersion in a tub. The refusal to bathe was not simply a matter of personal choice. It was deeply connected to the medical and cultural beliefs of the time. Theories of humors dominated European medicine. People believed the body was controlled by 4 fluids: blood phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. To disturb these balances by washing the skin with water was seen as dangerous. Doctors argued that water could enter the body through the pores, upset the humors, and bring on fever or plague. Thus, when French kings chose not to bathe, they were following what they believed was the best medical advice available to them. Instead of water, the kings relied on rituals of wiping and perfuming. Attendants would bring bowls of scented water with cloths. The king would dab his face hands and sometimes his underarms, but never truly wash. The rest of the body remained untouched by soap or water. Perfumed oils would then be rubbed into the skin, not to remove dirt, but to cover its smell. This meant that the kings were often sticky with layers of oil and powder resting on top of unwashed skin. The effect was one of constant heaviness and odor. Louis XV continued this tradition. He was surrounded by perfumes and powders. He wore heavily scented gloves and carried perfumed handkerchiefs. He believed that changing his linen each day was enough, and that to wash his body would only bring danger. Reports from his courtiers suggest that his odor was strong even through the layers of perfume, but since he was king, few dared to say so directly. Instead, they flattered his elegance, while quietly remarking on the air of staleness that followed him. The strange thing about this refusal to bathe is that it coexisted with an obsession for appearance. French kings were deeply concerned with how they looked. They spent hours dressing in fine clothing. They demanded wigs of perfect curls. They surrounded themselves with mirrors and jewels. And yet behind all of this splendor, they carried with them the unmistakable truth of bodies unwashed for months at a time. Their magnificence was a mask laid over habits that were filthy by modern standards. We should also remember that the palace itself made bathing difficult. The great halls of Versailles were not designed with bathrooms in mind. Water had to be carried by servants. Bathing tubs were heavy and awkward. Heating water took hours, and gallons were required to fill even the smallest of tubs. The effort was enormous, and in a place where bathing was already feared, it became almost unthinkable. Few kings would have chosen to endure the work when linen and perfume were believed to achieve the same goal much more easily. Eyewitnesses to court life often left behind small clues about how little the kings bathed. One ambassador wrote of his surprise that the king wore the same perfumes every day, yet never smelled truly clean. Another courtier described the wigs of the king as crawling with lice despite being powdered daily. Servants complained quietly about the burden of carrying chamber pots and wiping surfaces. Yet they never mentioned baths, because such things were not part of the royal routine. The refusal to bathe also shaped the way courtiers behaved. Since the king was the model for the entire court, his habits were copied by nobles and attendants. If the king avoided bathing, so did those around him. This created a cycle where the entire palace became a community of people who rarely, if ever, touched soap and water. Together they shared in the stench, and together they convinced themselves that perfume was enough. In this way, the habits of one man influenced thousands. To us today, this world may sound unbearable, but to them, it felt normal. The sweet smell of perfume mixed with the heavy odor of sweat was simply the air of the court. The feeling of linen against the skin was considered refreshing, even if the body beneath remained unwashed.
The refusal to bathe was not seen as disgusting. It was seen as wise. For French kings, to bathe was to invite sickness, but to remain dry was to stay alive. The habits of the king even influenced the architecture of the palace itself. Versailles was built with grandeur in mind, but not with personal hygiene. No bathrooms, no running water, and no drainage that would suit regular washing. Instead, there were chambers lined with fine fabrics and decorated with gold, where servants carried water in bowls or poured it into small basins meant only for hand washing.
The king-ass apartments had places for changing linen, for perfumes, and for grooming wigs, but no true baths. The absence of bathing facilities reinforced the idea that bathing was unnecessary and even unthinkable. What makes this all the more striking is that these same kings would hold elaborate rituals of dressing known as the lever in the morning and the coucher in the evening. Attendants and nobles would gather to watch the king change clothes or be prepared for bed. Every detail of clothing was chosen with care. Silk stockings were pulled over legs that had not been washed for months. Velvet coats were placed upon shoulders sticky with oil and perfume. Wigs were powdered and curled to perfection, while underneath the scalp remained itchy and covered in lice. This ceremony of elegance took place daily and gave the impression of supreme refinement. Yet at its heart, it was built on a foundation of filth. Even outside of the palace, French kings avoided baths during travel. When they moved with their courts from place to place, they carried perfumes, powders, and linens with them, but not bathing tubs. The idea of washing in a river or lake was beneath their dignity and considered too dangerous. Servants prepared scented cloths for wiping faces and hands, and the same rituals of perfuming took place on the road as they did at Versailles. Thus, the refusal to bathe was not only a palace habit, but a lifelong constant in every setting. The refusal also had consequences for health. French kings were often plagued with skin problems, boils, and sores. These conditions were worsened by the lack of washing and by the constant layering of oils and powders, yet rather than addressing these problems through cleaning, doctors continued to prescribe perfumes, ointments, and bleeding to balance the humors. The cycle of sickness and smell was therefore reinforced by the very medical advice that was supposed to prevent it. As Europe advanced, some people began to view bathing differently, but the kings of France held on to tradition. When travelers from other countries visited Versailles, they sometimes commented on the lack of washing among the French court. In places like Russia or parts of Germany, public bathhouses were common, yet in France, even the king himself refused the practice. These differences were noted with a mix of surprise and disgust, but for the French monarchy, they represented continuity and the wisdom of their doctors. The refusal to bathe lasted right until the decline of the monarchy itself. Even in the late 18th century, on the eve of revolution, French kings were still more familiar with powders, perfumes, and wigs than with soap and water. Their world was one of glittering appearances masking deep realities of neglect. By the time the monarchy was falling, many in France viewed the court as out of touch and decadent. The refusal to bathe became one more symbol of how far removed the kings were from the lives of ordinary people. The impact of this can still be imagined today. If one could walk into the chambers of a French king, one would be struck not only by the gold and silk, but by the smell. The perfume would be the first thing noticed, but behind it, there would be the undeniable odor of flesh that had not touched water in months. This is what it meant to be a king who refused to bathe, a king powerful enough to rule millions, yet unwilling to enter a simple bath. And so when we look back at this time, we see how the image of majesty was carefully crafted, while the reality was far less glamorous. The refusal to bathe was not just a quirk. It was a central part of how French kings lived, and how they believed they should protect their health. It explains why they smelled as they did, and why their courts were filled with the same odors. It was a choice rooted in fear, belief, and tradition. This brings us to the end of our second chapter, where we have seen how French kings refused to bathe for years at a time, trusting in linen and perfume instead of soap and water. Their fear of sickness shaped their habits, and their habits shaped the life of their entire court. The result was a royal world filled with splendor on the outside, but heavy with odor underneath. In the next chapter, we will move deeper into this strange reality. We will see how French kings used perfume, wigs, and powders to hide their unwashed bodies, and how these very things brought new problems such as lice, fleas, and constant irritation of the skin. This will be the subject of Chapter 3. French kings covered in perfume, wigs, and lice. As we move forward from the strange refusal of French kings to bathe, we step into a world that might appear glamorous at first glance, but hides something far less pleasant underneath. A world where the scent of roses and musk attempted to cover what human flesh had long abandoned. To imagine the grandeur of Versailles without considering its hidden realities is to misunderstand the life of the French monarchy. When people today think of French royalty, they often picture extravagant fashion, golden palaces, elaborate court ceremonies, and of course the famous powdered wigs and strong perfumes, yet beneath all that glitter lay the uncomfortable truth. Perfumes and wigs were not merely fashion statements, they were carefully cultivated methods to conceal the simple fact that the kings and nobles were rarely, if ever, truly clean. The French court became a place where scent and image were everything. Rooms were filled with the smell of roses, lavender, musk, amber, and cloves. Yet these fragrances were never purely for enjoyment. They existed to mask the pervasive odor of human sweat, unwashed skin, and clothing that had been worn for days or even weeks. Bathing, as we explored in the previous chapter, was rare, and the act of changing clothes did not necessarily mean cleanliness. Undergarments might be worn for days, even weeks before they were replaced. Outer garments, with their heavy fabrics, embroidery, and layers of silk or velvet, were far more difficult to clean and were often infrequently washed. In response, perfume became a substitute for bathing, a layer of olfactory deception that suggested freshness while reality remained unchanged. King Louis XIV, the Sun King, embodied this paradox. He was both obsessed with appearance and entirely unbothered by personal hygiene. His fondness for perfumes was legendary. It is said that he constantly ordered new blends, sometimes wearing a different fragrance every day, spraying his body, his clothing, Even his chambers with strong, musky scents derived from flowers, spices, and rare resins. The very air of Versailles was saturated with perfumes, thick with aromas that were intended to overpower the more unpleasant truths of sweat, body oils, and unwashed skin. Perfume was more than indulgence. It was a method of survival, a way to present majesty and elegance without confronting the realities of an unwashed body. And then there were the wigs, the iconic powdered wigs that we see in countless portraits of the French kings and nobility. These wigs were not merely fashion accessories, but practical instruments to mask a far less glamorous reality. Lice were a constant plague at the time. The infrequency of hair washing, coupled with crowded living conditions, made lice infestations almost inevitable. Wigs, often elaborately styled and heavily powdered, served to conceal bald patches caused by lice or skin irritation. The powders themselves were composed of starch, flour, and aromatic substances, sometimes tinted to white, gray, or even pastel shades. A grand white powdered wig on the head of a king was not just a statement of style. It was a calculated disguise designed to hide a reality of itch, infestation, and uncleanliness. Wigs, however, were not without their own problems. They were heavy and uncomfortable, sometimes weighing several pounds, and the powder that covered them could cling to clothing and skin, spreading through the palace air. Wearing such a wig all day meant breathing in fine powder mixed with oils and fragrances, a constant reminder of the lengths to which appearances had to be maintained. Wigs required extensive upkeep, being washed, powdered, and sometimes treated with animal fats to hold their shape, a process that could attract insects and make them breeding grounds for lice and other pests. A wig that looked pristine in a portrait was often anything but in reality, carrying its own collection of problems that added to the discomfort of the wearer. Perfume and wigs together created an entire culture of illusion at the French court. To stand in the hallways of Versailles was to be surrounded by dazzling images of refinement. Kings and courtiers dressed in layers of embroidered silk and velvet, wigs towering on their heads, scents of roses and jasmine drifting through the air. Yet beneath the surface, the truth was undeniable. The people were unwashed, their wigs were a response to lice, and their perfumes were masks against the stench of human neglect. Every element of this display was designed to prioritize appearance over reality. Social standing was not judged by cleanliness, but by the skill with which one maintained these layers of disguise. Even the daily rituals of court life supported this illusion. The lever and coucher, the elaborate morning and evening ceremonies of rising and retiring, involved attendants and courtiers assisting the king with dressing, grooming, and perfuming. Rooms would be sprayed with aromatic blends before the king entered, and the air would be thick with incense and scented powders. Courtiers often carried handkerchiefs perfumed with strong fragrances to press to their noses during crowded gatherings. There were perfumes specifically made for gloves, for clothing, for wigs, and even for the furniture. Everything was designed to create an artificial environment of cleanliness, while in reality, bathing remained an extremely rare event. The reliance on perfumes and wigs extended far beyond mere concealment. It became a defining feature of French culture spreading across Europe. Perfumes came to symbolize refinement and sophistication, while wigs were seen as markers of high social status. But at its core, this culture was a survival mechanism. In a society where poor hygiene was both common and dangerous, the kings and nobles developed a sophisticated system of deception. It was a world of appearances, where everything looked elegant, smelled sweet, and seemed orderly, while beneath it all, reality was much less appealing. The effect of these practices was not only personal, but architectural. Versailles itself was designed for grandeur, not hygiene. The palace lacked adequate bathing facilities, relying on basins, perfumed water, and attendants to manage what little washing occurred. Every corridor, ballroom, and chamber was perfumed and polished, but these efforts could not replace the human scent that clung to clothing and wigs. The palace became a theater of illusion, its beauty maintained to distract from the underlying reality of human neglect. Even in travel, French kings maintained these habits. Tents, carriages, and temporary palaces were treated with perfumes, wigs were worn for ceremonies, and attendants carried scented powders and cloths to maintain the illusion. The refusal to bathe was constant, irrespective of location or circumstance. The court adapted every aspect of life to preserve the appearance of cleanliness while continuing habits that ensured that actual cleanliness was rare. The physical toll of these practices was also significant. Unwashed skin covered in layers of oil and perfume could develop boils, rashes, and other dermatological problems. Lice and fleas were pervasive, hiding in wigs, clothing, and bedding. Despite these issues, doctors often failed to address the problem directly, prescribing ointments, powders, and bleeding to balance the humors instead of recommending actual washing. Perfumes, wigs, and powders became both a solution and a symptom, masking illness and infestation while prolonging discomfort and risk. The culture of perfume and wigs also reinforced social hierarchy. Those who could afford the most elaborate wigs and the strongest perfumes demonstrated wealth, status, and influence. Courtiers competed to maintain their own appearances, copying the king's habits, creating an entire ecosystem where appearance and scent dictated social standing. Those who neglected these customs were socially marginalized, reinforcing the necessity of maintaining the illusion of hygiene even when the reality of uncleanliness persisted. This world of illusion persisted for centuries. Even as some European nations embraced bathing and personal hygiene, French kings and their courts clung to their traditional practices. They believed strongly in the medical advice of their physicians and in the social structures that had defined their lives for generations. Perfume, wigs, and powdered hair became symbols not only of beauty, but of survival and of adherence to a centuries-old tradition. Walking through Versailles, one can imagine the juxtaposition of wealth and neglect. The air was heavy with fragrance and powdered starch. The visual splendor was overwhelming, yet the underlying reality was one of sticky skin, itchy scalps, and pervasive odors hidden beneath layers of scent. Every embroidered coat, every silk stocking, every powdered wig told a story of effort, of careful maintenance, and of an extraordinary dedication to creating an illusion of elegance that reality could never match. And so, as we close Chapter 3, we begin to see the deeper truths of French royal life. It was not simply about refusing to bathe. It was about creating entire systems of appearance that masked the reality beneath. Perfumes concealed smells, wigs hid lice, clothing disguised the passage of time and neglect. All of this was presented under the dazzling light of gold, mirrors, and chandeliers, as though the Sun King himself had nothing to fear. Yet beneath every layer, there was an undeniable reality of human neglect. This understanding prepares us for Chapter 4, where we will examine the royal palaces themselves, the grand halls of Versailles and beyond, and explore how beauty on the outside often hid filth and decay within, revealing the extraordinary lengths French kings went to maintain an image of perfection while avoiding the simplest act of hygiene, bathing. As we leave behind the intricate world of perfumes, wigs, and illusions that masked the reality of unwashed French kings, we step deeper into the very spaces that allowed these deceptions to thrive. The palaces themselves, magnificent and overwhelming in their beauty, were not merely stages for courtly ceremony, but also silent witnesses to a world where appearances were everything, and hygiene was almost entirely forgotten. If perfumes and wigs were the masks, the palaces were the theaters in which these masks were displayed, gilded halls concealing the smells, sweat, and human neglect that lay beneath the velvet curtains and polished floors. Versailles, the jewel of French architecture and the heart of royal life, was a palace built for grandeur and ceremony rather than comfort or cleanliness. Every corridor, gallery, and chamber reflected the Sun King's vision of power and elegance, but none of its design considered the practicalities of washing and maintaining personal hygiene. Water had to be drawn from distant fountains and cisterns, heated laboriously by servants, and carried in large tubs by multiple hands before it could reach the king, and even then bathing remained a rare and ritualized affair. The grand halls that we admire today with their marble floors and golden moldings were in reality corridors where the heavy perfumes of dozens of unwashed bodies mingled with the stench of oils, sweat, and occasional illness. The daily life of the palace reinforced this complex relationship between appearance and neglect. From the early morning lever, where the king's attendants assisted him in dressing and perfuming, to the late evening cowsher, every action in the palace was designed to sustain the illusion of refinement. Courtiers, visiting dignitaries, and even servants had to follow strict protocols in attire and scent. Linen and silk, heavily embroidered and luxurious, were worn with care, yet rarely washed. Perfumed gloves and handkerchiefs became extensions of the self, carrying the illusion of freshness into crowded rooms. Every inch of the palace was scented, polished, and prepared to disguise the absence of bathing. Even the architecture of Versailles and other royal palaces reflected these priorities. Bathrooms, as we understand them today, were virtually non-existent. Instead, rooms were designed for dressing, grooming, and ceremonial display. Basins of water were used primarily for dabbing the face and hands, never for immersion, while tubs for bathing were cumbersome, difficult to fill, and almost never employed. The very structure of the palace reinforced the habits of its inhabitants, making regular bathing both impractical and socially unnecessary. Servants became experts in carrying perfumed cloths and scented powders, their labor silently maintaining the illusion that the air of the palace was pure and clean. Behind the polished floors and golden chandeliers, filth was everywhere. Servants' quarters, kitchens, and corridors harbored odors that even the most potent perfumes could not fully mask. Waste disposal was rudimentary. Chamber pots were emptied into the gardens or courtyards, and the smell would often drift into hallways where the king and his guests walked. Carpets and tapestries, though visually stunning, absorbed sweat, oils, and dust over time, trapping odors and creating a hidden layer of uncleanliness. Even the most ornate furniture carried traces of human contact, sticky with oil and residue from countless hands. These were the realities that the royal perfumes and architectural grandeur could never fully erase. One must also consider the role of servants in maintaining this fragile illusion. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of attendants moved through Versailles daily, managing not only clothing and wigs, but also the smells, oils, and hidden layers of filth that accumulated. Chambermaids perfumed beds, pages carried scented gloves and powders, and valets attended to the king's wigs and garments. Every act was calculated to create the perception of cleanliness. Yet this labor was endless, because the root of the problem, the avoidance of actual washing, remained unaddressed. The palace, magnificent as it was, became a stage where human neglect was hidden by constant motion, scent, and ceremonial ritual. Even spaces designed for public ceremony, such as the Hall of Mirrors, bore the marks of this dichotomy between appearance and reality. The reflective surfaces dazzled visitors with light and grandeur, but beneath the shine, layers of dust, oils, and perfumes clung to the walls and floors. Guests attending court balls or royal ceremonies were often struck by the beauty of the palace, yet subtly noticed odors carried by the close crowd. An invisible reminder that despite gilded appearances, the palace was a living, human space subject to decay. The kitchens and dining halls of Versailles reveal yet another layer of hidden filth. Food preparation, storage, and waste management were handled under conditions that modern observers would find alarming. Meat, fruits, and vegetables were kept without refrigeration, and servants handled them with hands that were rarely washed, often coming directly from the handling of clothing, wigs, and chamber pots. The fragrance of cooking mixed with perfumes and the unavoidable odors of human neglect, creating a complex olfactory landscape where the reality of hygiene was entirely masked by scent and ceremony. Even outside the main palace, auxiliary buildings, stables, and gardens carried similar burdens. Horses were maintained for grandeur and transportation, yet their stables were crowded and unsanitary. Servants responsible for cleaning them often moved between stables, kitchens, and the king's private chambers. spreading the effects of human and animal filth across the palace. The illusion of cleanliness required constant vigilance, and yet, despite every effort, the underlying neglect remained present in every corner, in every corridor, in every hidden chamber. Visitors from other countries frequently commented on the paradox of Versailles. Ambassadors and foreign dignitaries marveled at the opulence and scale of the palace, noting the elaborate ceremonies and grandeur, but some quietly remarked on the strong smells of perfume and the faint, yet undeniable stench that lingered in certain rooms. These observations, while often polite and understated, revealed a subtle recognition that the palace's beauty and elegance relied heavily on illusion, that the layers of fragrance, powder, and ceremony were compensations for the absence of basic cleanliness. Even the king's personal quarters, carefully designed for comfort and display, were microcosms of this duality. Beds were draped with embroidered linens, scented powders sprinkled across mattresses, yet the sheets themselves were rarely washed. Clothing and undergarments were layered to protect the wearer from direct contact with the fabrics beneath, which had absorbed sweat, oils, and natural odors over days or weeks. Wigs rested atop the heads of kings, powdered daily, masking lice and itchiness. Perfume was applied liberally, ensuring that any signs of human neglect were concealed. This was the intimate reality of royal life, where grandeur and hygiene existed as entirely separate concepts. In addition, the sheer scale of Versailles and other palaces amplified the challenges of maintaining the illusion. Hundreds of rooms, thousands of doors, and extensive gardens required constant attention to maintain their appearance. Servants moved ceaselessly, polishing floors, sprinkling perfumes, adjusting clothing and wigs, and managing the king's personal rituals. Every element of the palace's grandeur was dependent on human labor, yet this labor could never replace the simple act of bathing. The system was self-reinforcing, a delicate balance between appearance and reality, maintained by ritual, scent, and the constant work of hundreds of attendants. Even after decades, small details betrayed the underlying truth. Carpets absorbed oils and sweat. Draperies, though dusted and perfumed, carried faint odors. Wooden floors retained traces of spilled wine, food, and bodily fluids. Perfumes masked, but did not eradicate. Wigs continued to harbor lice. Courtiers, servants, and even the king himself moved through this world of layered smells, invisible yet ever present, demonstrating that no matter how great the architectural achievements, the reality of human neglect was impossible to erase entirely. And so, as we close Chapter 4, we begin to see that the grandeur of French palaces was inseparable from the realities of neglect, human frailty, and avoidance of simple hygiene. The glittering halls of Versailles, the gilded mirrors, the embroidered fabrics, and the scent-soaked air were all parts of a complex system designed to maintain appearances while masking the unpleasant truths beneath. The illusion of perfection required constant labor, ritual, and the cooperation of hundreds, yet it could never fully conceal the reality of unwashed bodies, lice, sweat, and human odor. In the next chapter, Chapter 5, we will explore the private lives of the French kings and their close companions. We will look at the intimate habits that were hidden from public view, the personal rituals, and the lengths to which they went to maintain the image of elegance, revealing even more about the strange relationship between power, appearance, and cleanliness in the courts of France. As we step from the grand halls of Versailles, from the gilded mirrors, perfumed corridors, and layers of powdered wigs, into the private lives of the French kings, we begin to uncover a world even stranger than the public court could ever imagine. The rituals and habits that took place behind closed doors were a reflection not only of the power of these men, but also of their deep fear of water, their obsession with appearances, and the extraordinary lengths they would go to maintain an image of elegance and control. In the chambers and boudoirs of kings, where only the most trusted companions were allowed, the illusions of the palace continued, yet the realities of human neglect were far more intimate and immediate. Louis XIV, the Sun King, who had mastered the art of public spectacle, lived a life of private hygiene that would seem unthinkable to modern eyes. Despite his fascination with perfume, powders, and linen, he avoided immersion in water almost entirely. His daily routines involved elaborate dressing ceremonies where attendants would assist him in removing old linen and clothing, carefully replacing them with freshly perfumed garments, yet the king's skin beneath remained untouched by soap or water. His body was coated with oils and sweat, gradually accumulating layers over days and weeks, but the Sun King and those around him believed that the ritual of changing garments was sufficient to maintain cleanliness. Even more striking were the intimate rituals that surrounded his grooming. Attendants would dab scented cloths across his face, hands, neck, and sometimes underarms, never immersing him in water. The cloths themselves were often soaked in mixtures of rose water, lavender, or musk, applied not to remove dirt, but to cover its presence. Oil would then be rubbed into the skin, creating a sticky, fragrant layer that clung to the body. Wigs were meticulously arranged, powdered, and scented, hiding lice, dandruff, and the evidence of long-ignored hair hygiene. The king's private life was therefore a continuous performance, a delicate balance between comfort, health beliefs, and the maintenance of appearances. Louis XV, who followed the Sun King centuries later, continued these private rituals with equal devotion, if not greater intensity. Reports suggest that he would spend hours each morning with his closest attendants, adjusting wigs, perfuming gloves, and arranging clothing, all while avoiding the simplest act of bathing. When illness or fatigue threatened, remedies prescribed by royal physicians often involved more powders, oils, or fragrant rubs, rather than actual washing. The idea of immersion was still viewed as dangerous. Water, it was believed, could upset the humors, bring disease, and disturb the delicate balance of the body. The king's attendants became highly skilled in managing these rituals, understanding that the entire court depended on the king's appearance for its structure and rhythm. The private lives of French kings also reveal a constant tension between personal desire and societal expectation. In their bedrooms and private chambers, kings often engaged in intimate acts, yet these too were managed with a concern for odor and appearance. Perfumes, scented gloves, and handkerchiefs were not only decorative, they were essential to maintaining the illusion that even the most private moments were free from the unpleasant realities of human biology. The king's closest companions, including mistresses, courtiers, and family members, were trained to navigate these environments carefully, applying powders and perfumes where necessary, avoiding contact with unwashed areas, and ensuring that the delicate facade of cleanliness was never broken. One of the most extraordinary aspects of these private rituals was the sheer complexity of their implementation. A king might have dozens of attendants assigned to his personal care, each responsible for a specific aspect. One for linen, another for clothing, another for wigs, another for perfumes, and yet another for handling chamber pots. Each act, though routine, was a performance designed to protect both the king's health, according to contemporary beliefs, and his image of perfection. A single misstep, a forgotten powder application, an improperly adjusted wig, a slight odor, could disrupt the carefully maintained equilibrium, risking the illusion of elegance that defined court life. Even bedding, which modern readers might assume was washed frequently, was treated with similar practices of substitution rather than actual cleaning. Sheets were sprinkled with aromatic powders, mattresses aired and perfumed, but the fabrics themselves often remained untouched for weeks. The king might spend nights in beds that were visually immaculate and fragrant to the senses, yet carried layers of oils, sweat, and residues from past use. Courtiers were aware of these realities and, like the king, adapted to them, relying on layers of perfume, powder, and fabric to maintain the illusion of hygiene. The impact of these private habits extended beyond mere comfort. Health, as understood in the 17th and 18th centuries, was deeply intertwined with the avoidance of water. Physicians warned that bathing could open the pores, allowing sickness to enter the body, and therefore the king's private rituals of dabbing, perfuming, and layering oils were considered protective measures. In this context, the lack of bathing was not neglect, but adherence to the prevailing medical knowledge. The private life of the king was therefore both a sanctuary from water and a testament to the power of ritual over reality, where appearance, belief, and authority combined to shape every action. Even personal hygiene in the most intimate moments of the day was orchestrated with precision. When using chamber pots, which were inevitably necessary, kings were often assisted by attendants who discreetly managed waste and applied aromatic powders afterward. This created a delicate choreography of cleanliness and odor management that extended into every corner of private life. Every act, from dressing to sleeping, from eating to intimate encounters, was performed under the guidance of attendants and physicians to maintain a semblance of elegance. The social consequences of these private habits were profound. Courtiers and attendants were trained to imitate the king, creating an entire court culture in which avoidance of bathing became normative. Perfumes, powders, and wigs were not optional, but essential to social survival. To ignore these rituals was to risk exclusion or ridicule. The private habits of the king thus shaped the behaviors of hundreds of people, reinforcing a society in which illusion was more important than reality, and where hygiene was defined not by water and soap, but by appearance, scent, and ceremony. These rituals also reveal a deep psychological component. The kings, aware of their own vulnerability to illness and influenced by centuries of medical tradition, relied on avoidance, substitution, and performance to maintain both their health and their authority. The private sphere, where mistakes could be concealed from the public eye, became a laboratory for managing the body, controlling perception, and exerting influence over those around them. Every touch, scent, and garment was calculated, creating a private world that was as complex and demanding as the public pageantry of Versailles. Yet even within this carefully constructed system, the realities of human biology could not be entirely ignored. Skin irritation, rashes, lice infestations, and body odor persisted despite the elaborate layers of powders and perfumes. Attendants, well aware of these limitations, developed strategies to manage them, often resorting to fragrances, ointments, and ritualized rubbing to conceal what could not be cured. The private world of the king was thus a continual negotiation between the desires of appearance, the constraints of medical belief, and the inevitable truths of the human body. As we reflect on the private lives of these kings, it becomes clear that their elegance was both remarkable and fragile. The image presented to the world relied on careful orchestration behind closed doors, a world where hundreds of attendants performed endless rituals to maintain the illusion of perfection. Perfumes, powders, wigs, linen changes, and careful choreography replaced what modern audiences would consider simple acts of hygiene, creating a reality where wealth, power, and influence were inseparable from the avoidance of bathing. And so, as we reach the conclusion of our journey, we see that the hygiene habits of French kings were far more than personal eccentricities. They were a reflection of medical belief, cultural expectation, social hierarchy, and the extraordinary lengths to which humans will go to maintain appearances. The palaces, the public ceremonies, the wigs, the perfumes, and the private rituals all intertwined to create a world that was both magnificent and deeply flawed, beautiful on the outside, and for the most part unwashed on the inside. The story of French kings and their hygiene habits teaches us not only about the past, but about the ways in which culture, belief, and power can shape human behavior. It reminds us that history is not simply a record of events and grandeur, but also a study of human bodies, habits, and the extraordinary extremes to which society will go to create illusions of perfection. And with that, we come to the end of our exploration into the most disgusting hygiene habits of French kings. From perfumes and wigs to unwashed bodies and intricate private rituals, we have seen how even the greatest symbols of power were subject to the strange and fascinating constraints of their time. The Sun King and his successors may have avoided water, yet their story remains a remarkable testament to human ingenuity, belief, and the ever-present tension between appearance and reality.